Good evening and welcome. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether the room is quiet, the hour is late, or the day has left noise behind, I'm glad you are here. If you would like, leave your city and time where you are in the comments, a mark from one quiet corner of the world to another. Now settle in, let your shoulders loosen, and allow the old world to open slowly. Tonight we begin before the banners, before mailed knights, before the long roads east. We begin in the silence that came before the call. In the late 11th century, Europe was not a single place with one clear mind. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, villages, monasteries, forests, castles, and fields, held together by faith, fear, hunger, and habit. Most people lived close to the soil. They knew church bells better than distant cities. They measured life by harvests, feast days, winters, births, deaths, and the Christian year. To them, the world felt wide, dangerous, and full of unseen meaning. A storm could be punishment. Sickness could be a test. A journey could become a pilgrimage. Heaven and hell were not abstract ideas discussed only by scholars. They were close, almost physical, pressing against daily life like cold against a wooden door. A person might sin in anger, fear judgment, confess in church, and hope that mercy would still be waiting beyond death. This was a world where violence was ordinary, but salvation was precious. Lords fought neighbors over land. Knights trained for war from youth. Castles rose on hills like clenched fists of stone. Roads were unsafe. Law was uneven, and a poor family could be ruined by one bad harvest. Yet beside all this hardship stood the soft glow of candles before saints, the chant of monks before dawn, and the promise that suffering on earth might lead somewhere higher. That contrast matters. The Crusades were born not from faith alone and not from ambition alone, but from the meeting of both. Men and women looked at a troubled world and longed for certainty. Nobles wanted honor and land. Younger sons wanted a future. The poor wanted forgiveness, food, or meaning. Church leaders wanted unity and authority. Warriors wanted their violence cleansed by purpose. And somewhere beyond the maps most people would never see, Jerusalem waited in imagination like a golden point of light. No one in a small French village or a German valley could picture the Holy Land clearly. They knew it through sermons, scripture, relics, and stories carried by pilgrims. They imagined dusty roads where Christ had walked, hills where prophets had spoken, and a city where heaven seemed to have touched the earth. Jerusalem was far away, but emotionally it was near. It lived inside prayers. It appeared in paintings and church walls. It was spoken of with longing, as if distance could be crossed by devotion. But in the years before the First Crusade, unease was growing. Rumors moved slowly across Europe, changing shape as they traveled. Pilgrims had suffered on the road. Eastern Christians were said to be under pressure. The city of Constantinople, ancient and glittering, had asked the West for help. Muslim powers controlled Jerusalem, as they had for centuries. But now the political world around the eastern Mediterranean was shifting. To many ordinary listeners, these details blurred into a simpler feeling: the holy places were in danger. Whether that feeling was precise mattered less than the power it carried. Medieval people did not separate politics, faith, and fear the way modern minds often try to do. A threat to sacred places could feel like a threat to the soul itself. A distant conflict could become personal if preached from the pulpit with enough fire. And so, before armies gathered, before crosses were sewn onto tunics, before kings and princes calculated their chances, Europe was already prepared in spirit for a story larger than any one life. The night before the call was not one night. It was a long season of anxiety, devotion, and expectation. Across dark fields and candlelit churches, people waited without knowing they were waiting. Soon, a voice would give that waiting a direction. Jerusalem was never only a city. To the people of the medieval world, it was a memory, a promise, and a wound carried inside prayer. Long before most Europeans could imagine its streets, they knew its name. It rose in sermons, psalms, painted glass, and whispered stories from pilgrims who had crossed seas, deserts, and roads to kneel where sacred history unfolded. For Christians, Jerusalem was the place where Christ had suffered, died, and risen. Its stones were connected to the deepest mysteries of their faith. The city held the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to contain both Calvary and the tomb. To stand there, even for a moment, was to feel history becoming touchable. A pilgrim could weep, pray, confess, and hope that the burden of sin had grown lighter. But Jerusalem did not belong to Christian imagination alone. For Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the noble sanctuary, the city tied to the Prophet's night journey, and home to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. It had been part of the Islamic world for centuries, governed by changing dynasties, visited by scholars, merchants, soldiers, and worshippers. Its sacredness was deep, layered. For Jews, Jerusalem carried an older ache. It was the city of David, the place of the ancient temple, the direction of longing across centuries of exile and survival. Even when political power was absent, memory remained. The city lived in scripture, ritual, grief, and hope. It was not merely remembered, it was yearned for. This is why Jerusalem could not be treated like any other prize. A castle could be taken and retaken. A port could change hands. A border could move after a treaty. But Jerusalem carried meanings that no treaty could fully contain. It belonged to maps, but also to visions. It stood on earth, but people spoke of it as if heaven cast a shadow there. In medieval Europe, many people never traveled beyond markets or neighboring villages. Yet they could feel connected to Jerusalem through the rhythm of church life. Priests read from scripture, monks copied sacred texts. Pilgrims returned with palm leaves, badges, dust, relics, or stories. Some stories were truthful, some exaggerated, and some reshaped by distance. But all of them made the city feel alive. The distance itself made Jerusalem more powerful. Because most people could not see it, they imagined it. They pictured golden light, holy stones, crowded shrines, and narrow streets filled with the footsteps of prophets and saints. The real city was more complicated, noisy, political, diverse, dusty, and human. But imagination often smooths rough edges and turns places into symbols. By the late 11th century, those symbols had become emotionally charged. News from the East did not arrive cleanly. It came as rumor, sermon, complaint, and warning. Some pilgrims had faced hardship. Some Eastern Christians felt threatened by shifting powers. The Seljuk Turks had changed the balance of the region. To listeners in Europe, the details were often unclear, but the feeling was not. Something sacred seemed unsettled. That feeling gave preachers enormous power. When they spoke of Jerusalem, they were not only speaking of a distant city. They were speaking of salvation, duty, shame, hope, and belonging. They could make a knight believe his sword might serve God. They could make a poor farmer believe the road east might wash away sin. They could make a divided society imagine shared purpose. And yet, beneath the holy language, there was always contrast. Jerusalem promised peace, but called men toward war. It represented heaven, but was fought over by earthly rulers. It inspired tears of devotion, but would soon witness terrible violence. The city many imagined as pure and eternal stood at the center of human ambition, fear, and brokenness. To understand the Crusades, we must hold that contrast gently. The people who answered the call were not all monsters, and they were not all saints. They were people of their age, shaped by belief, pressure, longing, and ignorance. Jerusalem was the dream placed before them, glowing in the distance. But before that dream could become an army, another city had to send a message west. Constantinople, old Rome's surviving heir, was afraid. Constantinople stood where continents met. To the west lay the lands of Latin Christendom, divided by rival kings, restless nobles, and feudal wars. To the east stretched Anatolia, Syria, Armenia, and the roads that led deeper into the Islamic world. Between them rose the Byzantine capital, old, wealthy, ceremonial, and watchful, guarding the narrow waters between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. To travelers who approached its walls, the city could feel unreal. Defenses curved across the landward side, layered in stone and memory. Domes lifted above crowded streets. The imperial palace held rituals older than many Western kingdoms. In Hagia Sophia, gold mosaics caught candlelight, and the emperor appeared not merely as a ruler, but as the guardian of a Christian empire that still called itself Roman. Yet beneath that splendor, pressure was building. Byzantium had survived for centuries because it knew how to bend, negotiate, fortify, and endure. Its rulers used diplomacy as carefully as armies. They paid enemies, hired mercenaries, arranged marriages, and played one rival against another. Survival had become an art. But by the late 11th century, the empire's eastern frontier had become dangerously unstable. The greatest shock had come in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert. There, Byzantine forces suffered a serious defeat against the Seljuk Turks, and Emperor Romanos IV was captured. The battle did not destroy Byzantium in a single moment, but it opened the door to years of civil conflict and territorial loss. Anatolia, long a recruiting ground and source of grain, began slipping from imperial control. This loss mattered deeply. Anatolia was not just empty land on the edge of empire. It was the body behind Constantinople's shield. Its farms fed armies. Its villages produced soldiers. Its roads connected the capital to the eastern provinces. As Turkish groups moved through the region and local power shifted, Byzantium found itself less secure, less wealthy, and less able to command the old confidence of Rome. Inside the empire, politics made the danger worse. Aristocratic families competed for influence. Generals rose and fell. The throne itself changed hands through intrigue, rebellion, and necessity. By the time Alexios I Komnenos became emperor in 1081, he inherited a realm that still looked magnificent from a distance, but had been weakened by invasion, debt, and internal struggle. Alexios was not helpless. He was intelligent, disciplined, and politically skilled. He rebuilt the army, stabilized the government, and looked for allies wherever he could find them. But he understood something important. Byzantium needed soldiers, not a vast uncontrolled migration, not a holy war reshaping the East, but trained Western knights who could help recover lost territory and strengthen the empire's defenses. So Alexios turned west. His request to the Pope was practical at its core. He wanted military assistance against the Turks. He wanted men who could fight, serve, and then, ideally, return captured lands to Byzantine control. In his mind, this was diplomacy, strategy, and survival. But requests do not always remain what their authors intend. The Latin West heard the appeal through its own fears and dreams. To many Western churchmen, the suffering of Eastern Christians could be framed as a sacred crisis. To knights, the Eastern wars offered a place where violence might be given holy purpose. To the Pope, Alexios's request opened a possibility much larger than sending a few soldiers. It offered a chance to unite quarrelsome Christians, assert spiritual leadership, and direct the energy of warriors toward a distant, sanctified goal. Here the contrast becomes clear. Byzantium asked for help because it was vulnerable, but it still believed it could manage the terms of that help. The West answered with emotions and ambitions that no emperor could fully control. What began as a call for support would soon become a movement of crosses sewn onto cloth, vows spoken before altars, and thousands of people moving toward lands they barely understood. Constantinople had sent a message across the divide, but by the time that message returned, it no longer belonged entirely to Constantinople. It had passed through the imagination of the West, and there, under the voice of Pope Urban, it was about to become something far more dangerous and far more powerful. Pope Urban II understood the power of a moment. In November of 1095, he came to Clermont in central France, at a time when the Western Church was trying to strengthen its authority and calm the violence of a divided society. Bishops, abbots, nobles, knights, and ordinary listeners gathered beneath the cold sky, not yet knowing that words spoken there would send generations walking toward the east. Urban had received the Byzantine request for help, but he did not present it as a small matter of military assistance. He lifted it into something larger. The Eastern Christians, he said, needed aid. The holy places deserved protection. Warriors who had spent their lives fighting neighbors and spilling Christian blood could turn their swords toward a sacred purpose. In that promise lay the genius and danger of his appeal. For knights, the message reached a deep tension in their lives. They were trained for violence, rewarded for courage, and judged by honor, yet the church often warned them that violence stained the soul. Urban offered a path through that contradiction. A man could fight and still seek forgiveness. He could leave behind private feuds and ride for God. The sword, so often a symbol of sin, could be imagined as an instrument of salvation. For the poor, the call sounded different, but no less powerful. Life in medieval Europe was narrow for many people. Hunger, debt, sickness, and dependence shaped their days. A crusade promised movement, meaning, and perhaps mercy. To take the cross was to step outside ordinary life and enter a story that seemed blessed from above. Even those who had little could believe they possessed one priceless thing, a soul that might be saved. Urban's message also carried political weight. The Pope stood before a fractured Christendom where kings challenged churchmen, nobles fought each other, and local loyalties often mattered more than any wider unity. A crusade could gather that scattered energy under spiritual leadership. It could make the papacy appear not merely as a voice of prayer, but as the force capable of directing history. The exact words Urban spoke are uncertain. Later writers remembered the speech in different ways, shaping it according to their own hopes and assumptions. Some accounts describe promises of remission of sins. Others emphasize the suffering of Christians in the East or the sacred duty to free Jerusalem. What is clear is that the speech landed with extraordinary force. The crowd responded, not with quiet approval, but with a cry that would echo through crusading memory: God wills it. That cry mattered because it turned emotion into identity. People began sewing crosses onto their clothing. The cross became a sign of vow, burden, protection, and belonging. To wear it meant a person had stepped into a new role. They were no longer only a lord, a knight, a farmer, a monk, or a wanderer. They were a crusader, bound by promise to a road whose end few could imagine clearly. Yet, beneath the holiness of the moment lay tensions that would follow the movement for centuries. Urban spoke of unity, but the armies would carry rivalries with them. He spoke of sacred purpose, but many would also seek land, wealth, reputation, or escape. He spoke of helping Byzantium, but the Western forces would not always obey Byzantine expectations. A speech meant to heal Christian violence would also unleash violence in new directions. Still, for those who heard it, the call felt like clarity. Their uncertain world had suddenly been given a direction. The road east became more than geography. It became penance, adventure, duty, and hope. The promise was simple enough to move thousands: leave what you know, take up the cross, and walk toward the city where heaven had touched earth. From Clermont, the message spread through villages, castles, monasteries, and market roads. Preachers carried it with urgency. Nobles weighed it against ambition. Ordinary people whispered it beside hearths. Soon, Europe would no longer be waiting in spirit alone. It would begin to move slowly at first. Then, with a force no ruler, bishop, or emperor could completely command or predict. The road had opened, and history had begun to walk eastward. Before the princes gathered their banners, another crusade had already begun to move. It did not look like the careful army pope Urban may have imagined. It was rougher, poorer, hungrier, and far less prepared. Across parts of France and Germany, preachers carried the message from Clermont into fields, villages, and crowded market squares, where people listened with fear, wonder, and sudden hope. Among the most famous voices was Peter the Hermit. Later stories would make him larger than life, a thin, intense preacher riding a donkey, speaking with a force that seemed to set whole communities in motion. The exact details of his role are difficult to separate from legend, but what is clear is that preaching like his reached people who had little place in the plans of kings and nobles. For ordinary men and women, the call to crusade could sound like an opening in a closed world. A peasant who owed labor to a lord, a poor knight with no inheritance, a widow with few protections, a hungry family living close to the edge of winter, all could hear the promise differently. The road east became not only a military path, but a road of forgiveness, escape, miracle, and meaning. Many who joined this first wave were not trained soldiers. Some carried weapons, but others carried bundles, children, tools, or little more than faith. They did not fully understand the distance to Jerusalem. Maps were rare, geography was uncertain, and the world beyond the next region could already feel foreign. Still, they moved. To stay behind may have felt like refusing a summons from heaven. There was something moving in that hope, but also something dangerous. When large numbers of frightened and excited people begin walking under sacred language, devotion can turn quickly into suspicion. Before many of these groups even left Europe, some turned their anger against Jewish communities along the Rhine. Men who claimed they were marching to defend Christ-attacked neighbors who had lived among them for generations. These massacres were among the darkest early signs of what crusading emotion could become. They showed how holy language, when joined to fear and ignorance, could turn inward before it ever reached the distant enemy it imagined. Bishops and local authorities sometimes tried to protect Jewish communities, but protection was uneven, and in many places it failed. The road to Jerusalem was stained before it truly began. Even where there was no massacre, the People's Crusade struggled against the basic realities of movement. Crowds needed food, water, shelter, and discipline. They passed through lands that had not prepared to feed them. They begged, bought, stole, argued, and frightened the people whose villages they entered. What had sounded holy in a sermon became difficult on the road, where hunger and confusion reduced lofty vows to daily survival. When these early groups reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios faced a problem he had not asked for. He had wanted trained warriors who could serve a strategic purpose. Instead, he saw uncontrolled crowds arriving at his gates, fired by faith but lacking order. Constantinople must have seemed overwhelming to them, with its walls, markets, churches, languages, and imperial ceremonies. To the Byzantines, the newcomers looked less like rescue and more like risk. Alexios moved them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, perhaps hoping to keep them away from the capital and closer to the enemy they had come to fight. But the People's Crusade was not ready for the world it had entered. In unfamiliar land, divided by poor leadership and false confidence, many advanced too recklessly. Turkish forces defeated them near Sifitote in 1096, and the dream that had carried them east collapsed with terrible speed. Yet their failure did not end the crusade. It revealed what the movement was becoming, powerful enough to move thousands, but dangerous when faith outran preparations. Behind them, the armies of princes and knights were still gathering. They would come with armor, horses, money, rivalries, and clearer command. But they too would discover that the road east was longer and harsher than any sermon had promised, beneath the calm words spoken at home before the journey began, or could truly fully explain. By the time the noble armies began to move, the crusade had taken on a different shape. This was no longer a loose river of poor pilgrims and fiery preachers. It was becoming a procession of lords, knights, horses, servants, wagons, priests, cooks, armorers, and followers, all traveling under vows that joined sacred purpose to very human ambition. The road east now carried banners as well as prayers. The leaders were not one single army under one simple command. They came from different regions, spoke different languages, and carried different expectations. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, would later be remembered for his piety and restraint. Raymond of Toulouse was older, wealthy, and deeply committed to the crusading vow. Bohemond of Taranto brought military skill, boldness, and the ambitions of a Norman prince who understood opportunity when it appeared before him. Others came as well, with their own households, reputations, and private calculations. Some sought forgiveness, some sought honor, some wanted land, some wanted adventure. Some may have truly believed they were leaving everything for God. Most carried more than one motive at the same time, because human beings rarely move through history for only one reason. The crusade gave them language noble enough to cover many desires. Before they could reach the Holy Land, they had to pass through the Byzantine world. This created unease from the beginning. Emperor Alexios needed their strength, but he feared their independence. The crusading princes needed Byzantine roads, markets, guides, and supplies, but they distrusted Eastern ceremonies, Greek-speaking officials, and imperial demands. The same faith joined them in theory, yet custom, language, politics, and memory kept them apart. At Constantinople, the Western leaders were asked to swear oaths to Alexios, promising to return former Byzantine lands they might recover. For the emperor, this was reasonable. He had requested help to restore his empire. For some crusaders, the oath felt like a chain placed around a holy mission. They had crossed Europe for Jerusalem, not to become servants of Constantinople. Suspicion settled quietly among the tents. Still, the armies crossed into Asia Minor. There the journey changed again. The familiar landscapes of the west fell behind them, and the heat, distances, and exposed roads of Anatolia began to test the movement. Horses weakened. Supplies ran thin. Water became precious. Armor that looked glorious in Europe became heavy beneath the eastern sun. The dream of holy war met dust, thirst, and exhaustion. The capture of Nicaea in 1097 gave the Crusaders an early success, though even that victory carried tension. The city surrendered to Byzantine forces, not directly to the Crusaders, preventing the Western armies from looting it. Alexios gained a recovered city, but some Crusaders felt cheated of reward. Already, victory itself was teaching them that allies could disappoint one another as deeply as enemies. Soon after, at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders faced Turkish horsemen whose speed and tactics were unlike the warfare many Western knights knew best. Arrows came from distance. Riders appeared, withdrew, circled, and returned. The heavy cavalry of Europe could be powerful, but only when it could close with its enemy. The battle was frightening, confusing, and hard, yet the Crusaders survived. And survival strengthened their belief that Providence walked with them. But belief did not make the road gentle. The march through Anatolia was one of the great ordeals of the First Crusade. Men died of heat and thirst. Horses collapsed, leaving knights to walk beside the poor. Equipment was abandoned, tempers sharpened. Hunger pressed against discipline. In the evenings when fires burned low and the strange sky darkened above them, the distance to Jerusalem must have felt almost endless. This long march changed the Crusaders. The road stripped away easy promises and left behind something harder: endurance. They had begun as warriors of a sacred vow, but they were becoming survivors. Every mile east made return more difficult and victory more necessary. Ahead lay cities whose names carried both danger and desire. The next great test would not be a road, but walls, hunger, and the terrible patience of siege. There at Antioch, faith would be tested not in speeches, but in starvation, fear, and waiting together silently. Antioch rose before the Crusaders like a test carved in stone. Its walls stretched across hills and valleys, guarded by towers, gates, ravines, and the memory of older empires. To tired men who had crossed Anatolia with cracked lips and thinning horses, the city must have seemed both magnificent and impossible. Jerusalem still waited far beyond them, but Antioch stood in the way, and the road could not continue until it fell. The siege began in October 1097, and almost immediately the Crusaders discovered that surrounding a great city was not the same as conquering it. Antioch was vast, too large for their army to seal completely. Supplies slipped in and out. Defenders watched from the walls. The besiegers built camps outside, but they were exposed to weather, hunger, disease, and raids. The army that had survived the road now had to survive stillness. Stillness can be harder than movement. On the march, suffering has direction. At a siege, suffering repeats itself. Each morning could look like the last cold ground, thin food, tired animals, anxious prayers, and the same walls rising beyond reach. Winter came harshly. Rain turned camps into mud. Food prices rose. Horses died, and with them much of the army's strength. Some men deserted. Others stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Inside the Crusader camp, faith and fear pressed closely together. Priests preached endurance. Leaders argued over strategy. Knights who had once imagined glory found themselves searching for roots, scraps, or anything that could be eaten. The poor suffered most, as they always did when supply failed. Yet even nobles felt the siege consuming them. Armor could not protect a man from hunger. A famous name could not fill an empty stomach. Antioch also revealed the uneasy nature of Crusader leadership. Bohemond of Taranto watched the city with particular interest, seeing not only a military obstacle, but a possible prize. Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey, and the others had their own concerns. They were bound by a shared vow, but not by perfect trust. Each victory raised the question of who would benefit from it. Even before Antioch fell, ambition was walking beside devotion. After months of hardship, the city was taken through betrayal from within. A guard named Firuz, according to many accounts, allowed Bohemon's men to enter by night. The Crusaders climbed to open the way, and Antioch fell in June 1098. Yet the victory brought no peace. Almost at once, a large Muslim relief army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived, trapping the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. The besiegers had become the besieged. It was one of the cruel reversals of the First Crusade. Inside Antioch, food was scarce, morale was weak, and escape seemed unlikely. Some believed the expedition had reached its end. Others searched for signs that God had not abandoned them. In that atmosphere of exhaustion, a proven ale peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to discover the Holy Lance, the spear believed to have pierced Christ's side. Whether the relic was genuine was debated even then. Some accepted it with tears and renewed courage. Others doubted quietly or openly. But in a starving city surrounded by enemies, belief itself could become strength. The discovery gave shape to hope. It told desperate men that heaven still saw them, that suffering had meaning, and that the road to Jerusalem had not been closed. When the Crusaders finally marched out against Kerboga, they were weak in body, but fierce in spirit. Their victory shocked observers and revived the movement. Antioch had nearly destroyed them, yet it also hardened them into something more determined. The siege showed the crusade at its most revealing. Holy purpose mixed with hunger, ambition, fear, visions, betrayal, and survival. But Antioch left wounds behind. Bohemond kept the city, deepening tension with Byzantium and with fellow crusaders. The army had won, but unity had frayed. Ahead lay the final road south, toward the city that had filled their prayers from the beginning. Jerusalem was closer now, but the men who walked toward it were no longer the same men who had left Europe. They carried victory, exhaustion, and the memory of walls that had almost broken them. Jerusalem was the name that had carried them across rivers, mountains, hunger, and fear. After Antioch, after months of delay and argument, the crusading army turned south again, smaller than before, but fixed on the city that had lived inside every sermon. The road passed through heat, dust, olive groves, and towns watching from behind walls. By the summer of 1099, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Many fell to their knees when they first saw it. Some wept, some prayed. To them, the long-imagined city had finally become stone and light before their eyes. Yet the sight also revealed a hard truth. Jerusalem was not waiting open to receive them. It was defended, fortified, and held by a Fatimid garrison that understood what was coming. The Crusaders were exhausted and short of supplies. They had few horses, limited water, and not enough equipment for an easy siege. The land around Jerusalem was dry, and thirst became one of their first enemies. Men searched wells and cisterns, animals weakened. The same holy city that seemed to promise rest now forced them into another ordeal of waiting, labor, and suffering. They needed siege towers, ladders, and engines, but wood was scarce near the city. Timber had to be found, carried, shaped, and assembled under pressure. Ships arriving at Jaffa brought some supplies and skilled workers, helping the Crusaders prepare for the assault. Each beam raised outside the walls was more than a tool of war. It was a sign that the final act of the pilgrimage was becoming unavoidable. Inside Jerusalem, fear must have been heavy. Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians lived under the shadow of siege, uncertain what would happen if the walls failed. The city was sacred to many, but sacredness did not protect ordinary people from the decisions of armies. Behind gates and rooftops, families listened for the sounds of construction, shouting, prayer, and approaching violence. The Crusaders fasted, prayed, and processed barefoot around the city, echoing biblical images of sacred conquest. To them, ritual and warfare did not stand apart. The soul and the sword moved together. They believed that purity, repentance, and divine favor mattered as much as ladders and towers. In that belief there was devotion, but also a dangerous certainty. On the 15th of July, 1099, the assault broke through. Crusaders entered Jerusalem after bitter fighting on the walls. What followed was victory for them, and catastrophe for many within the city. The sources describe terrible killing, though numbers and details vary. It is enough to say that the capture was marked by blood, terror, and the collapse of mercy beneath the force of holy war. Then came the strange contrast that still defines the First Crusade. Some of the same men who had taken part in violence walked to the holy places in tears. They prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believing they had reached the goal of their vows. Their joy was sincere. So was the suffering around them. History often holds both truths at once, without making them comfortable. Jerusalem had fallen, but the meaning of that fall was never simple. To the Crusaders, it seemed like proof that God had guided them through every hunger, wound, and impossible mile. To those who survived inside the city, it was devastation. To the wider Muslim world, it would become a wound remembered and answered. A holy dream had been fulfilled, but it had left behind grief. The First Crusade had achieved what many thought impossible. A movement born in a speech at Clermont had crossed Europe, survived Anatolia, taken Antioch, and captured Jerusalem. Yet success created a new problem. Pilgrims could go home, but rulers had to remain. The city needed walls, laws, taxes, soldiers, and alliances. The promise of holy liberation now became the burden of government, and so the Crusaders stood inside Jerusalem, not at an ending, but at the beginning of a fragile experiment. Their prayers had brought them to the city, their swords had opened its gates. But holding this sacred place would demand something slower, colder, and more difficult than conquest. It would require kingdoms built on foreign soil, surrounded by enemies, memories, and promises already beginning to break. The victory at Jerusalem did not leave the Crusaders with peace. It left them with responsibility. The army that had arrived as pilgrims now stood inside a city that needed gates guarded, streets governed, markets restored, and enemies watched. A holy place had been taken, but it could not be held by tears and prayers alone. It required the colder work of rule. Many Crusaders had fulfilled their vows and wanted to go home. They had crossed the world as they understood it, survived hunger and siege, and reached the Sepulchre. For them, the journey was complete. But if everyone returned west, Jerusalem would be lost almost as quickly as it had been captured. Someone had to stay, and staying meant turning conquest into a kingdom. At first, even the title of ruler felt uneasy. To call oneself king in the city, where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, seemed too proud for some. Godfrey of Bouillon accepted leadership, but tradition remembers him avoiding the title of king, preferring a humbler form of rule. Whether the wording was exactly as later writers claimed, the meaning was clear. Jerusalem was not an ordinary throne. After Godfrey's death, his brother Baldwin became king, and the kingdom of Jerusalem began to take firmer shape. Around it stood other Latin states formed from Crusader victories and ambitions: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli. Together, these lands would later be called Outremer, the land beyond the sea. On a map, they could look impressive. In reality, they were thin, stretched, and exposed. Their rulers controlled cities, roads, castles, ports, and pockets of farmland. But they were surrounded by larger Muslim powers, local rivalries, and landscapes they were still learning to understand. The Crusader states were not a solid wall. They were more like lanterns along a dangerous road, bright in places, vulnerable between them. Castles became essential. Stone fortresses rose or were expanded on hills, near passes, above roads, and beside frontiers. They were places of defense, taxation, storage, and warning. From their towers, soldiers watched trade routes and approaching armies. To travelers, these castles could seem permanent, but their strength depended on men, supplies, water, and money, and all of those could fail. The military orders emerged from this need. The Templars and Hospitallers began as protectors of pilgrims and servants of the sick, but over time they became disciplined fighting institutions with land, wealth, fortresses, and influence. They lived by religious vows, yet fought like soldiers. In them, the strange mixture of monk and warrior became one of the defining images of the crusading age. Trade also helped the new kingdoms survive. Italian maritime cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa brought ships, merchants, money, and connections across the Mediterranean. Ports like Acre became lifelines. Through them came pilgrims, weapons, horses, textiles, spices, news, and reinforcements. The sea connected Outremer to Europe, but it also reminded everyone how dependent these kingdoms were on distant support. Ruling foreign soil required compromise. Latin Christians lived among Eastern Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, and many others. Some communities paid taxes and continued their work. Some local elites negotiated with the new rulers. Farmers still had to plant. Merchants still had to bargain. Water still had to be managed. Life could not remain in a permanent state of crusading excitement. And yet danger never vanished. A border raid, a succession dispute, or the death of a strong ruler could shake the entire balance. The Crusader states had been born from astonishing victory, but victory had not made them secure. They were kingdoms of prayer and paperwork, castles and caravans, courage and anxiety. Jerusalem had been won by force, but now it had to be held by patience. And patience in that hot and divided land would prove far harder than anyone who first took the cross could have imagined. Every season asked the same quiet question: would enough ships arrive? Enough knights remain? Enough alliances hold? And enough faith survive the ordinary burden of government? The answer was never certain, and that uncertainty settled over Outremer like heat above the stones. Long after the first victory songs faded, life in the Crusader states was never as simple as the banners made it seem. From far away, Europe imagined Outremer as a Christian frontier carved out of danger, a chain of holy strongholds defending Jerusalem. But for the people who actually lived there, the world was more complicated, more practical, and often quieter than the language of crusade allowed. In the streets of Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Acre, many languages could be heard. Latin knights spoke beside Greek priests, Armenian merchants, Syrian Christians, Arabic-speaking farmers, Jewish craftsmen, Muslim traders, sailors from Italy, pilgrims from France, and officials trying to keep order among them all. The land was not empty when the Crusaders arrived. It was old, crowded with memory, and full of people who already knew its seasons, taxes, markets, and roads. For Western settlers, daily life required adjustment. The heat was different, the food was different. The distances felt strange. Clothing, architecture, medicine, and habits slowly changed under Eastern influence. Some newcomers remained proudly Latin, holding tightly to the customs they had brought across the sea. Others adapted because survival often asks quietly for compromise long before pride is ready to admit it. Trade softened some boundaries. A merchant cared about safety, price, and trust as much as belief. Muslim and Christian traders could bargain over grain, cloth, spices, horses, oil, and metalwork even while rulers prepared for war elsewhere. Ports like Acre became meeting places of profit and suspicion. Ships came and went, carrying pilgrims one way and sugar, silk, glass, and stories the other. Religion shaped everything, but it did not make every moment violent. Churches, mosques, and synagogues existed within a landscape of unequal power and shifting tolerance. Some Muslim communities lived under Latin rule by paying taxes or accepting local arrangements. Eastern Christians sometimes found themselves caught between Latin rulers and Muslim neighbors, belonging fully to neither side in the eyes of outsiders. Jews, too, lived with memory, caution, and vulnerability. The military orders stood at the edge of this society, like watchmen who never fully slept. Templars and Hospitallers guarded roads, escorted pilgrims, managed estates, and held castles near dangerous frontiers. Their discipline gave the kingdom strength, but their growing wealth and independence also created tension. They were servants of faith, yet also political powers in their own right. Pilgrims continued to arrive, and their presence kept Jerusalem emotionally alive. Some came after months at sea, frightened and awed by every hill mentioned in Scripture. They wanted relics, blessings, confession, and proof that their journey had meaning. For them, the Crusader states were not merely governments. They were guardians of sacred access, keepers of the road to salvation. But ordinary life carried fear beneath its routines. A farmer working near a border might hear rumors of raids. A merchant might watch politics change the safety of a road overnight. A noble family might depend on a marriage alliance with people they privately distrusted. The frontier was not always burning, but it was rarely at peace in the heart. Children were born in Outremer who had never seen Europe. They inherited Western names and Eastern sunlight. They grew up among mixed languages, imported customs, local servants, and stories of a homeland that was often more imagined than remembered. To them, the Crusader states were not an expedition. They were home, fragile but familiar. This is the softer truth beneath the wars. Enemies fought, but they also negotiated. Faith divided, but trade connected. Castles threatened, but markets required cooperation. The Crusader state survived because people learned to live in the spaces between certainty and necessity. Yet this delicate world depended on balance. It needed strong rulers, steady ships from the west, divided enemies, and enough trust to keep daily life moving. When that balance held, Outremer could seem almost permanent. When it weakened, the kingdoms trembled. Beyond the borders, Muslim leaders were beginning to understand that the Latin states could be resisted not only by raids, but by patience, unity, and a deeper call of their own. That answering call would gather slowly, first in scattered efforts, then under harder rulers who saw Jerusalem not as a loss to endure, but a wound to heal. After years of uneasy survival, the Crusader states began to face a different kind of enemy. In the early decades after Jerusalem's capture, Muslim powers around them had often been divided by rival dynasties, local ambitions, and old suspicions. That division had helped the Latin states endure. But division does not last forever, especially when a wound remains visible on the map. One of the first rulers to change the balance was Imad ad-Din Zengi. He was not a gentle figure, and no careful history should make him into one. He was a hard military leader, ambitious, ruthless when necessary, and skilled at using both force and politics. From his power base in Mosul and Aleppo, he began to pressure the weakest edges of the Crusader world. The county of Edessa was especially vulnerable. It was the oldest of the Crusader states, founded before Jerusalem itself had fallen, but it was also isolated, stretched inland, and surrounded by stronger neighbors. Unlike coastal cities that could receive help by sea, Edessa depended on roads, alliances, and the strength of rulers who were not always present when danger came. To imagine Edessa in those years, picture not only walls and watchtowers, but a frontier society, living with uncertainty. Armenian Christians, Latin rulers, local communities, merchants, clergy, and soldiers all existed inside a political arrangement that had never been entirely secure. The county survived because surrounding powers were busy elsewhere. When those powers turned their attention toward it, its weakness became painfully clear. In 1144, Zengi moved against Edessa. The city was not prepared for the full weight of his attack. Its ruler, Jocelyn II, was away when the siege began, and help did not arrive in time. For the defenders, the days inside the walls must have felt increasingly narrow. Each sound from outside, each rumor, each weakening point in the defenses made the future feel smaller. When Edessa fell, the shock traveled far beyond the city. To the people who lived there, it was immediate catastrophe, families broken, churches lost, power overturned, and a familiar world suddenly ended. To the wider Crusader states, it was a warning. One of their own had disappeared. The frontier had not merely bent, it had broken. In Europe, the news arrived as grief and alarm. The First Crusade had left behind a powerful memory of impossible victory. Jerusalem had been taken against all expectation. Antioch had survived against the odds. Outremer, for many Western Christians, seemed protected by the meaning of its own existence. Edessa's fall challenged that comforting belief. If one Crusader state could vanish, perhaps others could too. The emotional force of the news came from contrast. The Latin East had been imagined as a sacred achievement, a sign that God had favored the long road east. Yet now, a piece of that achievement had been taken back. The language of holy victory had to make room for loss, and loss is often harder for movements to explain than hardship. Zengi's victory also mattered within the Muslim world. It showed that the Latin states were not invincible, and that resistance could be organized around both political ambition and religious language. The idea of jihad, already present in Islamic thought, began to gain renewed public force as leaders and preachers framed the recovery of lost lands as a sacred and communal duty. Still, this was not yet full unity. Muslim politics remained complicated, and Zengi himself would be killed in 1146. but the direction had changed. The Crusader states could no longer depend so easily on the divisions around them. A new pattern was forming: stronger rulers, sharper memory, and a growing belief that Jerusalem's loss could someday be answered. Edessa's fall became the bell that rang across two worlds. In the east, it announced that the Crusader frontier could be broken. In the west, it stirred shame, fear, and renewed preaching. Soon, another crusade would be called, this time with kings at its head. But the road ahead would reveal that answering loss is not the same as reversing it, and that sacred disappointment can weigh heavier than hope. For many, the first dream had begun to darken at last, quietly, in silence. The fall of Edessa reached Europe like a cold wind under a chapel door. It disturbed the memory of the First Crusade, because that earlier victory had taught many Western Christians to believe that impossible journeys could end in holy success. Now the news was different. A Crusader state had fallen, and the road east seemed to call again, not with wonder, but with accusation. The preacher most closely tied to the new call was Bernard of Clairvaux. He was not a king, not a soldier, and not a man of worldly decoration. He was a monk, austere and intense, whose words carried extraordinary force. When Bernard preached, listeners felt not only instructed, but searched. He spoke to conscience, shame, fear, and hope, making the loss of Edessa feel like a wound every Christian heart had to answer. This time, the response reached the highest ranks of Europe. King Louis VII of France took the cross, bringing royal dignity and restless devotion to the movement. Conrad III of Germany also joined, giving the crusade an authority the first expedition had not possessed in quite the same way. To many watching from churches, roads, and towns, it must have seemed that history was preparing to correct itself. Yet royal banners did not make the road easier. The Second Crusade suffered from the old problems in new forms: distance, hunger, mistrust, poor planning, and the difficulty of moving large armies through unfamiliar lands. The armies traveled separately, and both faced hardship in Anatolia. Turkish forces harassed them, supplies failed, and confidence weakened long before they came close to the holy places they hoped to defend. The relationship with Byzantium remained uneasy. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos received the crusading rulers with ceremony, but beneath the gold and diplomacy lay suspicion. The Byzantines feared Western armies as much as they needed Western help, and the Crusaders often misunderstood Byzantine caution as betrayal. Once again, Christians who claimed a shared faith found themselves divided by language, politics, memory, and pride. By the time the Crusaders reached the Levant, the original purpose had already blurred. Edessa, the city whose fall had summoned the expedition, was not easily recoverable. Instead, the leaders chose to attack Damascus, a powerful and ancient city that had not been the original cause of the crusade. The decision remains one of the great puzzles and failures of the movement. Damascus was not just a target, it was a living city of gardens, markets, walls, water channels, scholars, families, and political importance. The Crusaders approached it with hope, but the siege quickly unraveled. Local resistance stiffened, supplies became uncertain. Disagreements emerged among the crusading leaders and the barons of Jerusalem. What had begun as a confident royal campaign became a scene of confusion and mistrust. After only a few days, the siege was abandoned. The Crusaders withdrew, leaving behind anger and humiliation. For Louis and Conrad, the failure was heavy. They had come with crowns, vows, and the blessing of famous preaching, yet achieved almost nothing. For the Crusader states, the result was worse than disappointment. Damascus, once a possible ally against other Muslim powers, was pushed toward closer alignment with their enemies. The Second Crusade wounded the idea of crusading success. The First Crusade had seemed to prove that God rewarded endurance. The second raised a quieter, more troubling question: what if holy intention did not guarantee victory? Bernard himself had to answer criticism, explaining failure through sin and divine judgment rather than weakness in the crusading idea. For ordinary believers, the lesson was difficult. The road east had consumed treasure, lives, and trust. Kings had marched, monks had preached, prayers had risen, and still the outcome was failure. The promise had not vanished, but it had become heavier. Crusading was no longer only the memory of Jerusalem captured in triumph. It was also Edessa lost, Damascus abandoned, and a silence after hope. In that silence, new forces gathered. Muslim leaders learned from the divisions of their enemies, and the dream of recovering Jerusalem grew stronger in the hands of men who could join belief to patient power. The next great name would rise slowly from that gathering shadow and patient resolve. The failure of the Second Crusade left behind more than disappointment. It left space. In that space, across the cities and deserts of the Near East, Muslim rulers, soldiers, scholars, and preachers continued to imagine a different future. The Crusader states still held Jerusalem, but the certainty around them had weakened. Their enemies had seen them fail. Their borders still stood, but the idea that they could last forever no longer felt as solid as stone. Out of this changing world came Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, remembered in the West as Saladin. He was born into a Kurdish family connected to the service of powerful Muslim rulers. His rise was not sudden, and it was not simple. He did not appear from nowhere as a perfect hero of legend. He moved through a world of courts, armies, rivalries, obligations, and opportunities, learning how power worked before he fully possessed it. Saladin's early career was tied to Nur ad-Din, the ruler who had inherited and expanded the mission of resistance after Zengi. Nur ad-Din was deeply important because he gave the struggle against the Crusader states a stronger religious and political shape. He promoted the idea that Muslim unity was necessary if Jerusalem was ever to be recovered. Under him, the language of jihad gained renewed public strength, not only as war, but as reform, discipline, and shared purpose. Saladin entered Egypt through the campaigns of his uncle Shirkuh, who served Nur ad-Din. Egypt at that time was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty weakened by internal division and external pressure. Control of Egypt mattered enormously. It meant wealth, grain, armies, ports, and strategic depth. Whoever held both Syria and Egypt could place the Crusader states under pressure from more than one direction. When Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin became vizier of Egypt. He was still young in the world of high power, and many underestimated him. Yet he moved carefully. He strengthened his position, managed rival factions, and gradually replaced Fatimid authority with loyalty to Sunni Islam, and at least outwardly to Nur ad-Din's wider cause. In 1171, the Fatimid Caliphate ended, and Egypt entered a new political and religious order. This was one of the great turning points before the fall of Jerusalem. The Crusader states had long benefited from divisions among Muslim powers. Egypt and Syria had often been separate, suspicious, or hostile to one another. Saladin's control of Egypt began to change that balance. At first, he still had to move cautiously around Nur ad-Din's authority. But when Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the path opened for Saladin to build something larger. He did not unify the region overnight. Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and other centers had their own rulers, loyalties, and fears. Saladin had to fight, negotiate, marry, promise, persuade, and wait. His reputation for piety helped him, but piety alone did not win cities. He needed armies, money, legitimacy, patience, and the ability to make rivals believe that his leadership served more than personal ambition. That is what made his rise so effective. Saladin presented himself not merely as a conqueror, but as the servant of a sacred cause. Jerusalem, still in Latin Christian hands, became the emotional center of his political project. The more he gathered Muslim lands under his influence, the more the recovery of the Holy City seemed possible. It was not just a dream spoken in sermons, it was becoming strategy. But Saladin was also a ruler of the real world. He made truces when needed. He fought Muslim rivals as well as crusaders. He rewarded loyalty, punished opposition, and understood the value of reputation. Later stories would remember his generosity, mercy, and nobility, and there is truth in parts of that memory. But he was also ambitious, disciplined, and practical. History becomes clearer when we allow him to be fully human. By the 1180s, the balance around the Crusader states had changed. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem still possessed castles, knights, military orders, and sacred prestige, but it was increasingly surrounded by Saladin's influence. What had once been a frontier of divided enemies was becoming a tightening circle. The Crusaders had survived for generations because the world around them was fractured. Saladin's patient work was beginning to close those fractures. Inside Jerusalem's kingdom, weakness was growing at the same time. Rival factions argued. Leadership was uncertain. Bold men mistook provocation for strength. The peace that had protected trade and survival became harder to maintain. Saladin waited, watched, and prepared. He did not need the Crusader kingdom to collapse all at once. He only needed the right moment, the right mistake, and the patience to turn pressure into history. That moment was coming. The road that had begun with Zengi, deepened under Nur ad-Din, and widened under Saladin was leading toward a dry battlefield near the horns of Hattin. There, beneath the hard sun, thirst, pride, and strategy would meet, and the dream born in 1099 would begin to break. The road to Hattin began with heat, pride, and broken restraint. For years, fragile truces had allowed the Kingdom of Jerusalem to breathe. Trade moved, pilgrims traveled, and both sides sometimes accepted that survival required patience. But patience was not shared by every lord on the frontier. Raids, insults, and private ambition could pull entire kingdoms toward war. One of the most dangerous figures was Raynald of Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, whose attacks on Muslim caravans and threats toward the Red Sea angered Saladin deeply. To Saladin, these actions were not merely border trouble. They were provocations against order, honor, and sacred obligation. They gave him the moral and political opening he needed to call his forces together with unusual strength. Inside the Crusader kingdom, leadership was troubled. King Guy of Lusignan held the crown, but not universal trust. Rival nobles disagreed over strategy. Some urged caution, knowing that Saladin's army was large, mobile, and dangerous in open country. Others believed honor demanded movement. The kingdom still had brave knights and strong castles, but courage can become fragile when judgment is divided. In July 1187, the Crusader army marched toward Tiberias, where Saladin had laid pressure to draw them out. The decision carried them away from secure water sources into dry, exposed ground. The sun was merciless. Armor trapped heat. Dust rose beneath men and horses. Thirst became a weapon before swords fully met. Saladin did not need to destroy them quickly. He needed to let the land help him. Near the horns of Hattin, two volcanic hills rising from the dry landscape, the Crusaders found themselves surrounded and exhausted. Muslim forces harassed them with arrows, smoke, and pressure. The true cross, carried as a sacred sign of divine favor, stood among them, but even the holiest relic could not fill empty water skins. The army that had once seemed the shield of Jerusalem began to come apart. The battle ended in disaster. Many Crusaders were killed or captured. The military orders suffered heavily. King Guy was taken prisoner. Raynald of Chatillon was executed by Saladin himself, remembered as punishment for repeated violations and threats. The loss of the true cross struck Latin Christians with spiritual force as well as military fear. It was not only an army that had fallen, it was a symbol. After Hattin, the kingdom lay open. Castles and towns surrendered, some quickly, some after negotiation. Saladin moved with purpose, taking advantage of the victory before his enemies could recover. The road to Jerusalem, guarded for generations by Crusader confidence, was suddenly exposed. The city that had been taken in 1099 now faced the return of Muslim power. Jerusalem prepared as best it could. Its defenders included refugees, clergy, civilians, and a reduced fighting force under Balian of Ibelin. Fear moved through the streets, but so did memory. Everyone knew what had happened when the city fell to the Crusaders nearly 90 years earlier. The past stood like a shadow over the walls. Many feared revenge would answer revenge. Saladin besieged the city in September 1187. The defense was determined, but the situation was hopeless. Balian negotiated surrender, and here the contrast with 1099 became central to the story. Jerusalem did not fall into massacre. Many inhabitants were ransomed, though not all could pay, and suffering still followed. Yet Saladin's capture of the city was remembered for restraint compared with the bloodshed of the First Crusade. For Muslims, Jerusalem's recovery was a moment of immense spiritual and political meaning. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa were cleansed and restored to Islamic worship. For Latin Christians, it was a heartbreak that echoed across Europe. The dream that had justified generations of crusading had broken. The Holy City was lost again. And yet the story did not end in silence. News traveled west, stirring grief, shame, and urgency. Kings would take the cross. Armies would gather again. The fall of Jerusalem did not close the age of crusading. It summoned its most famous answer. Across Europe, the old promise returned with a sharper edge. If Jerusalem could be lost, then perhaps it could be won again, if only enough kings, ships, prayers, and swords were sent east together. When the news of Jerusalem's loss reached Europe, it did not arrive as ordinary news. It arrived like a wound. For nearly 90 years, the city had stood at the center of the crusading imagination, proof that the impossible road east had once ended in triumph. Now that proof had been taken away. Churches mourned, preachers warned, and rulers understood that the loss of Jerusalem demanded an answer larger than anything sent before. The response became the Third Crusade, remembered partly because of the famous kings who took the cross. This was no longer only a movement of nobles, pilgrims, and frontier lords. It drew some of the greatest rulers of Western Europe into the same distant struggle. Their names carried weight before they ever reached the sea. Frederick Barbarossa of the German Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, later called the Lionheart. Frederick Barbarossa was the oldest and most experienced of them. He had spent a lifetime ruling, fighting, negotiating, and defending imperial authority. To many, his decision to take the cross gave the crusade a grave and almost ancient dignity. His army was large, disciplined, and impressive, moving overland toward the east with the confidence of a ruler who had survived decades of political storms. But the road east had never respected human reputation. In 1190, while crossing Anatolia, Frederick drowned in the Salif River. The details were simple and devastating. A great emperor, whose presence had promised strength, was gone before reaching the Holy Land. His army, shaken by grief and uncertainty, began to fall apart. Some turned back, some continued, but the crusade had lost one of its pillars before the central struggle had even begun. Philip of France and Richard of England came by sea. Their participation brought power, money, and prestige, but also rivalry. They were both kings, both proud, both conscious of reputation, and neither entirely free from concerns at home. Crusading vows did not erase politics. Even while they sailed toward a sacred cause, they carried the tensions of Europe with them. Richard was especially suited to the imagination of war. He was bold, energetic, and drawn to command in the field. His courage was real, and so was his appetite for glory. Philip was more cautious, colder perhaps, and more focused on the long game of kingship. Together, they represented the strength of the West, but also its divisions. Even in holy war, kings remained kings. Before the main campaign could press toward Jerusalem, the Crusaders focused on Acre, the great port city on the coast. Acre mattered because it was a gateway. Whoever held it could receive ships, supplies, pilgrims, soldiers, and money from across the Mediterranean. Without secure ports, the dream of retaking Jerusalem would remain almost impossible. So the struggle gathered around Acre's walls. The siege of Acre had already begun before Richard and Philip arrived, and it had become one of the harshest contests of the crusading age. Camps spread outside the city. Disease moved among soldiers. Supplies came and vanished. Muslim and Christian forces pressed against one another in a long, exhausting contest of endurance. The sea brought help, but not comfort. Every victory seemed partial. Every delay made the air heavier. When the kings arrived, hope rose among the Crusaders. Their presence gave shape to a campaign that had been dragging under the weight of fatigue. Siege engines were built. Attacks intensified. Negotiations shifted. The city, trapped between pressure from land and sea, finally surrendered in 1191. Acre's fall was a major victory, but not the end the Crusaders truly wanted. Jerusalem still lay inland, under Saladin's control. The road to it would be harder than the capture of one port. Heat, water, distance, disease, and disagreement all remained. The Third Crusade had gathered kings and legends, but it had also already learned humility. An emperor had drowned. Allies distrusted one another. Victory at Acre had come slowly and painfully, and beyond the coastal camps, Saladin still watched. He had lost Acre, but not the war. Richard had arrived with energy and fame, but fame alone could not open Jerusalem's gates. The crusade now moved toward a quieter and more difficult test, not whether kings could win battles, but whether even the strongest kings could turn victory into restoration. Richard and Saladin never met face to face in the way later imagination sometimes wishes they had. Their struggle unfolded through messengers, battles, truces, gifts, rumors, and careful gestures across a landscape worn down by heat and war. Each man understood the other as an enemy, but not as a fool. Between them grew a strange respect, sharpened by danger and limited by the vows both had to serve. After Acre fell, Richard needed to move south along the coast. He knew that control of the shoreline mattered. Ships could bring food, horses, weapons, and reinforcements, while the sea guarded one side of his march. Saladin, watching closely, could not allow the Crusaders to move freely. His forces shadowed them, striking, testing, and waiting for disorder. At Arsuf in 1191, that pressure became battles. Saladin's cavalry harassed the marching Crusaders with arrows and sudden attacks, hoping to break their formation. Richard held his army together with discipline, forcing men to endure the torment until the right moment came. When the charge finally broke out, it struck hard. The Crusaders won the field, and Richard's reputation rose even higher. Yet Arsuf did not deliver Jerusalem. That was the painful truth beneath the victory. The city lay inland, away from the easy support of ships. To march there meant crossing dry country, risking supply lines, and perhaps reaching the walls only to find the army too weak to hold what it captured. Richard could win battles, but the land itself asked colder questions. The Crusaders took Jaffa and strengthened their coastal position. From there, the dream of Jerusalem seemed close enough to Acre. Some men wanted to march immediately. Others understood the danger. Rain, mud, hunger, and uncertainty slowed decisions. Twice, Richard came near the road to Jerusalem. Twice, the army turned back. Few moments in crusading history feel more quietly bitter than that nearness without a rival. For the ordinary soldiers, this must have been difficult to bear. They had crossed seas, endured disease, buried friends, and followed kings under the sign of the cross. Jerusalem was not an idea to them anymore. It was somewhere beyond the hills, close but unreachable. The promise that had carried Europe east now stood just out of reach, like a light seen through mist. Saladin too was under strain. His victory at Hattin had been immense, but years of war had worn down his resources and his men. Holding together a coalition was never easy. Emirs had their own interests, armies tired, money thinned. The image of effortless Muslim unity was no more complete than the image of perfect Crusader unity. Both sides were powerful, and both were exhausted. So diplomacy became as important as battle. Messengers moved between camps. Proposals were made, refused, reshaped, and returned. There were discussions of territory, pilgrimage, prisoners, and marriage alliances. Some ideas were practical, some symbolic, and some impossible. Yet the talks showed that even holy war had to make room for negotiation when bodies, horses, and treasuries could no longer bear endless fighting. In 1192, an agreement was reached. The Crusaders would keep a narrow strip of coast from Tyre to Jaffa. Christian pilgrims would be allowed access to Jerusalem, but the city itself would remain under Muslim control. It was not the victory preached in Europe. It was not the restoration many had imagined. It was a compromise shaped by exhaustion. Richard soon left for the west, pulled back by political dangers at home. Saladin died the following year, his health and strength spent after years of command. Their contest entered memory almost immediately, becoming a story of chivalry, honor, rivalry, and unfinished purpose. Later generations polished both men into symbols larger than life, but the truth is quieter and more human. Richard saved the Crusader presence on the coast, but did not recover Jerusalem. Saladin defended the city, but could not drive the Crusaders completely into the sea. Both achieved something, neither achieved everything. The Third Crusade ended not with a final triumph, but with a treaty, a road still open to pilgrims, and a promise still broken. From that unresolved ending, later crusades would inherit both hope and a growing sense of quiet failure. The Fourth Crusade began with the same old direction in its prayers: Jerusalem. By the end of the Third Crusade, the Holy City remained under Muslim rule, though pilgrims could visit and the Crusaders still held a narrow coastal strip. To many in Europe, this was not enough. The wound had been covered, not healed. The promise still waited beyond the horizon. In 1198, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade. He was young, forceful, and deeply convinced of papal authority. To him, the recovery of Jerusalem was not only a military goal, but a spiritual duty that could renew Christendom under the leadership of the Church. The call sounded familiar, but the world around it had changed. Crusading now required more planning, more money, and more ships. The chosen strategy was to strike through Egypt. This was not a random idea. Egypt was wealthy, powerful, and strategically vital. If Crusaders could take control there, they might weaken the Muslim powers that held Jerusalem and create a stronger path back to the Holy City. The plan was practical, even if the language surrounding it remained sacred. But practical plans depend on practical arrangements, and here the Crusaders entered dangerous ground. They made a contract with Venice, one of the great maritime powers of the Mediterranean. Venice would build and provide ships to transport the army, horses, supplies, and equipment. In return, the Crusaders would pay an enormous sum. It was a bold agreement, but it rested on one fragile assumption: that enough Crusaders would arrive with enough money. They did not. When the army gathered at Venice, it was smaller than expected, and the funds were not sufficient. The ships had been built, the Venetians had invested labor and resources, and the debt remained. Suddenly, a holy expedition stood trapped by arithmetic. The road to Jerusalem had become a financial problem. Venice, led by the aged and formidable Doge Enrico Dandolo, offered a solution. The Crusaders could help capture Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic that had rebelled against Venetian control. In exchange, payment could be delayed. The proposal revealed the first deep fracture in the Crusade's soul. An army sworn for the recovery of holy places was being asked to attack fellow Christians. Some objected. Some were horrified. Some left, but many stayed, because debt, momentum, obedience, and desperation had already narrowed their choices. Zara was attacked in 1202 despite papal disapproval. The city fell, and with it something invisible also fell: the clean image of a crusade moving only towards sacred purpose. From Zara, the movement drifted further. A Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, promised money, military support, and church reunion if the Crusaders helped restore him to power in Constantinople. The offer was tempting because it seemed to solve everything at once: pay the debt, support the expedition, heal the division between Eastern and Western churches, and then continue to the Holy Land. Yet promises are easiest to make before power is won. The Crusaders sailed toward Constantinople, the very city whose earlier request for help had helped begin the crusading age. Now Western Crusaders came not as uneasy allies, but as armed creditors and political gamblers. The goal of Jerusalem had not disappeared from their words, but it had moved farther from their actions. This was the tragedy of the Fourth Crusade. It did not turn aside in one sudden moment. It drifted step by step, each compromise explained by necessity, each delay justified by the hope of continuing later. Holy language remained, but the road beneath it had changed. The cross still marked their clothing, but the path now led toward Constantinople's walls. And in that slow turning, the crusade revealed one of history's quiet dangers. People can betray an original purpose without ever admitting that they have abandoned it. They can tell themselves that one compromise is temporary, one wrong road is necessary, one broken promise will be repaired later. But roads have their own power. Once taken, they carry travelers toward consequences no sermon at the beginning had described. And for Constantinople, waiting beneath its domes and walls, those consequences were drawing nearer with every sail through the grey, uneasy spring sea. Constantinople had seen enemies before. For centuries, its walls had faced armies, sieges, ambition, and fear. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and others had approached its defenses, only to find the city difficult to break. It stood between sea and land like a memory of Rome made visible, crowned with domes, guarded by towers, filled with churches, markets, palaces, relics, and old imperial pride. But in 1203 and 1204, the danger came wearing the cross. That was the wound that made the Fourth Crusade different. The men outside the walls did not arrive as open enemies of Christianity. They came as Latin Christians, sworn in theory to recover Jerusalem. Yet their ships, debts, bargains, and ambitions had brought them to the greatest Christian city of the East. At first, the Crusaders helped place Alexios Angelos on the Byzantine throne, expecting the rewards he had promised. But promises made in exile proved harder to fulfill inside Constantinople. The empire was strained, the treasury limited, and the people of the city deeply suspicious of the Western army camped near their walls. Tension grew between Latins and Greeks, between expectation and reality, between the money promised and the money available. The relationship collapsed slowly, then suddenly, fires damaged parts of the city. Crowds turned against rulers seen as weak or compromised. Palace politics shifted again, as they so often had in Byzantine history. The Crusaders, unpaid and angry, began to see Constantinople not as an ally to be restored, but as a prize that might settle their losses. Sacred purpose had become entangled with debt and resentment. In April 1204, the Crusaders attacked. Venetian ships pressed against the sea walls while knights and soldiers fought to force entry. Constantinople's defenses were mighty, but the city was divided and weakened. Once the attackers broke through, the old capital of the Christian East faced something it had not endured for centuries: conquest from within the Christian world. The sack that followed became one of the darkest memories of the crusading age. Churches were looted, homes were invaded. Treasures accumulated over hundreds of years were carried away, broken, sold, or sent west. Relics changed hands. Sacred spaces that had once held candlelight, chanting, and imperial ceremony were treated as storehouses of wealth. The violence was not only physical, it was symbolic. Hagia Sophia, the great church of the city, stood at the center of this humiliation. To Byzantines, it was not simply a building. It was a vision of heaven in stone and gold, the spiritual heart of their empire. To see it violated by fellow Christians was a shock deeper than military defeat. It suggested that the language of shared faith had become too thin to restrain greed. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople, but it was never truly secure. They had gained a city and damaged a civilization, yet they had not moved closer to Jerusalem in any meaningful way. The Byzantine world fractured into successor states, and although Greek rule would eventually return to Constantinople in 1261, the empire never fully recovered its old strength. The consequences lasted for generations. Trust between Eastern and Western Christians, already fragile, was deeply wounded. The divide between the Latin West and Greek East became harder, colder, and more bitter. To many Byzantines, the Fourth Crusade proved that the West could be as dangerous as any external enemy. To later historians, it became a symbol of crusading contradiction, holy vows leading to unholy actions. And still, the men who took Constantinople did not necessarily see themselves as villains. That is part of what makes the story so unsettling. They had explanations, grievances, debts, fears, and justifications. They could tell themselves that betrayal had forced their hand, that God had allowed victory, that the road to Jerusalem might still continue. But history remembers where they actually went. The Fourth Crusade began with Jerusalem in its prayers and ended with Constantinople in ruins. It showed how a sacred mission could be redirected by money, pride, politics, and the slow erosion of purpose. After this, the crusading dream did not die, but it changed. Its brightness dimmed, its promises sounded less pure, and the road ahead would be filled with efforts to recover not only a city, but a meaning that had begun to break. After the wound of Constantinople, crusading did not end. It continued, but it carried a heavier shadow. The old promise remained: Jerusalem should be recovered, pilgrims should walk safely, and Christendom should answer the loss of the holy city. Yet after 1204, the language of crusade sounded less innocent. Too many roads had bent away from their stated destination. Still, popes preached, nobles vowed, and ordinary believers listened. The idea was too powerful to disappear. Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule, and as long as that was true, the crusading imagination could not rest. But leaders had learned something from earlier failures. Marching directly toward Jerusalem across hostile land was dangerous. Holding it, even if captured, would be harder still. Strategy began to shift toward Egypt. Egypt mattered because it was the great southern strength behind Muslim power in the region. Its wealth, grain, ports, and armies made it a foundation for any ruler who wanted to hold Syria and Palestine. If crusaders could capture Egypt, they might bargain for Jerusalem or weaken the forces defending it. It was a practical plan wrapped in sacred longing, a colder road toward the same glowing city. The Fifth Crusade followed this logic. In 1218, Crusader forces attacked Damietta, a city near the mouth of the Nile. To Western eyes, Egypt must have felt both rich and strange: river water, reeds, heat, flat horizons, and a landscape ruled by floods, rather than the hills and forests many had known at home. The army settled into siege, and once again holy purpose became waiting, sickness, mud, hunger, and negotiation. Damietta eventually fell in 1219, and for a moment the Crusaders held a powerful bargaining peace. The Sultan, Al-Kamil, offered terms that reportedly included the return of Jerusalem in exchange for leaving Egypt. But confidence, disagreement, and hope for greater victory led the Crusaders to refuse. It was one of those moments where history seems to pause quietly, offering a door that people do not recognize until it has closed. The campaign then moved deeper into Egypt toward Cairo, and the Nile itself became an enemy. Floodwaters, poor planning, and Muslim resistance trapped the Crusaders in a worsening position. The army that had dreamed of controlling Egypt found itself unable to control the ground beneath its feet. In 1221, the expedition collapsed and Damietta was returned. The road to Jerusalem had again led through suffering and ended in failure. Yet the strange story of the later Crusades was not only failure by battle. Sometimes diplomacy did what armies could not. The Sixth Crusade, led by Emperor Frederick II, was unusual because Frederick was under excommunication and arrived with more negotiation than holy thunders. In 1229, through treaty with Al-Kamil, he gained Christian control of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth for a time, without a major battle. This should have looked like triumph, but it felt uneasy. Jerusalem was recovered, yet not by the kind of crusading purity many expected. The Temple Mount remained under Muslim control. The city was not strongly defensible, and Frederick's political conflicts with the papacy made the achievement controversial. The Holy City had returned, but in a fragile negotiated form, like a candle rillet in a windy room. Over the following years, that candle flickered. Jerusalem changed hands again in 1244, when Khwarezmian forces captured and devastated the city. The loss led to another wave of alarm, another attempt to answer history with vows and armies. But each new crusade had to carry the weight of all the ones before it. Clermont, Jerusalem, Edessa, Hattin, Acre, Constantinople, Damietta, treaties made and broken. The search for a way back had become a pattern. Europe kept looking east with longing, but the world had changed. Muslim powers adapted. Crusader resources thinned. Political conflicts at home interrupted sacred plans abroad. The dream still lived, but it was tired now, pulled between faith and strategy, memory and exhaustion. And into that tired dream stepped one of the last great crusading kings, a ruler whose sincerity was beyond doubt, but whose devotion would meet the same hard limits that had broken so many before him, under distant skies, beside rivers that did not care for vows or crowns. Among the later crusading kings, Louis X of France stands apart because his devotion was not a mask worn for politics. It was woven into his life. He prayed, fasted, heard petitions, gave alms, and tried to rule as a Christian king in the fullest medieval sense. To his admirers, he was justice seated on a throne. To history, he became Saint Louis, one of the final great royal faces of the crusading dream. Louis lived in a world where the memory of Jerusalem still burned, but no longer with the clean brightness of the First Crusade. Too much had happened. Edessa had fallen. Hattin had broken the old kingdom. Constantinople had been sacked by men wearing crosses. Damietta had been won and lost. Jerusalem itself had slipped through Christian hands again. The dream remained sacred, but it was scarred. For Louis, those scars did not make crusading meaningless. They made it more urgent. After recovering from a serious illness in the 1240s, he took the cross, believing his survival demanded a vow. His crusade was not improvised. He prepared with unusual care, gathering money, ships, supplies, and men. The target once again was Egypt, because Egypt seemed to be the key that might unlock Jerusalem. In 1249, Louis and his army captured Damietta. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old pattern might finally turn toward success. The city fell quickly, and confidence rose. But Egypt had already humbled crusaders before. Its rivers, canals, heat, disease, and distances could weaken an army as surely as swords. The Nile landscape did not behave like the battlefields of France. It asked different questions. The Crusaders moved inland toward Mansoura. There, their campaign began to unravel. Fighting became confused and costly. Robert of Artois, Louis's brother, was killed after a reckless advance. Disease spread through the army. Supplies weakened. The movement toward Cairo became impossible. What had begun as disciplined royal crusading slowly turned into exhaustion, sickness, and retreat. Then came humiliation. Louis himself was captured in 1250, along with many of his men. A king who had crossed the sea to restore Christian honor now sat as a prisoner in the land he had hoped to conquer. His release required a massive ransom and the surrender of Damietta. The victory that had opened the campaign was undone, and Egypt remained beyond Crusader control. Yet Louis did not simply return home at once. He spent years in the remaining Crusader territories, strengthening walls, negotiating, organizing defenses, and trying to preserve what was left. This matters. His crusading was not only dramatic battle, it was also administration, patience, and repair. He understood that the Latin East was fragile, and he gave it time, money, and attention when many others had already turned away. Eventually he returned to France, but the dream did not leave him. In 1270, older and still devoted, Louis launched another crusade, this time toward Tunis. The reasons were mixed: strategy, politics, hope of conversion, and Mediterranean calculation. But the campaign ended not in holy triumph, but in sickness. Disease swept through the camp, and Louis died there, far from Jerusalem, beneath the heat of North Africa. His death feels like a quiet symbol of the later Crusades. Here was a king sincere in faith, disciplined in preparation, and willing to suffer for his vow. Yet sincerity could not overcome distance, disease, politics, and the changing balance of power. The age of great crusading kings was fading, not because belief had vanished, but because belief alone could not rebuild what history had already worn down. After Louis, crusading continued in different forms, but the old dream of restoring Jerusalem through grand royal expeditions grew dimmer. The remaining Crusader cities on the coast still watched the sea for ships from the west. They still prayed, traded, argued, and waited behind walls. But help came less strongly now, and the forces gathering against them were harder to resist. The story was moving toward its final shore, where Acre stood crowded, anxious, and almost alone. Acre waited at the edge of the sea like a city trying to hold back time. By the late 13th century, it had become the great remaining heart of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Jerusalem was gone. Edessa was memory. Many inland castles had fallen or stood isolated. But Acre still breathed, crowded behind walls, open to ships, and heavy with the knowledge that it carried more history than safety. To approach Acre from the water was to see a city of masts, towers, stone, and noise. Ships from Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Cyprus, and other ports moved through its harbor, bringing merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, priests, grain, timber, weapons, cloth, and news. The sea was its lifeline. Everything the city hoped to remain depended on those routes across the Mediterranean. Inside the walls, Acre was not a quiet holy town. It was busy, divided, wealthy in places, poor in others, and full of competing powers. Italian merchant quarters guarded their privileges. Military orders held strong compounds. Nobles argued over authority. Clergy served churches filled with memory. Pilgrims arrived still hoping to touch the edges of sacred geography, even though Jerusalem itself lay beyond Latin control. The city carried the contradictions of the crusading age in miniature. It was a fortress and a marketplace, a place of prayer and bargaining, a refuge and a rivalry. Men might speak of holy purpose in one street and negotiate shipping fees in the next. Knights of the temple and hospital prepared for war, while merchants counted profit beside the harbor. The cross remained visible, but survival required coin, grain, diplomacy, and discipline. Acre's population was mixed and restless. Latin Christians lived beside Eastern Christians, Jews, Muslims, sailors, craftsmen, translators, and travelers who came and went with the ships. Languages overlapped in markets and alleys. Rumors moved quickly. A dispute between merchants could become political. A street fight could become a diplomatic danger. The city was alive, but its life was tense. Beyond the walls, the world had changed. The Mamluks who had risen to power in Egypt and Syria were disciplined, formidable, and determined to remove the remaining Crusader footholds. They had already taken castles and towns that once seemed strong. Their advance was not a sudden storm, but a steady tightening. Each lost fortress made Acre feel more exposed. Each year made the sea behind it more important than the land before it. The Crusader states had once imagined themselves as kingdoms. By Acre's final years, what remained felt more like a chain of coastal fragments, dependent on truces, reinforcements, and the uncertain attention of Europe. Western rulers still spoke of crusade, but their politics were tangled at home. Promises traveled more easily than armies. Prayers reached faster than ships. Inside Acre, people must have felt this uncertainty in different ways. A merchant might worry about cargo. A knight might study the walls and count men. A mother might listen for rumors while buying bread. A pilgrim might kneel in church, grateful to have reached the east at all, unaware how close the old dream was to its last hour. History often ends this way, not with everyone understanding the moment, but with ordinary routines continuing under a darkening sky. The military orders remained among the city's strongest defenders. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights possessed training, fortifications, and wealth, yet they were not always united. Rivalries, pride, and separate commands weakened the common cause. Acre needed one clear heart, but it contained many. That had always been part of Outremer's problem. Courage was abundant, but unity was fragile. Still, Acre endured. Its walls stood, its harbor filled, its churches rang with prayer. At sunset, light would have touched the sea and the stone towers, softening fear for a moment. From a distance, the city may have looked permanent, but permanence was an illusion the Crusades had taught again and again. The last great stronghold was waiting, and beyond its walls the final siege was gathering. Soon, the sounds of trade and prayer would be joined by drums, engines, and falling stone. Acre, crowded with memory, would learn that the sea could bring help, but not enough to stop an ending final. Acre's final siege began in 1291, when the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil brought a vast army against the city. The warning had been visible for years. One fortress after another had fallen. Treaties had thinned. Reinforcements from the west had arrived too late, too few, or not at all. Now the last great stronghold of the Latin East faced the weight of an ending. The defenders looked out from walls that had once seemed strong enough to hold memory itself. Beneath them spread the Mamluk camp, filled with soldiers, engineers, siege engines, tents, animals, and the patient machinery of conquest. The sound of preparation must have carried into the city. Hammers shouted orders, creaking timber, prayers, and the low human murmur of an army that did not intend to leave. Inside Acre, fear moved through crowded streets. Merchants, pilgrims, sailors, monks, knights, families, servants, and refugees all understood different pieces of the danger. Some still hoped for ships. Some trusted the walls. Some prepared to flee. Others had nowhere to go. A city built on movement now found itself trapped between the sea behind it and the army before it. The siege was brutal, but it should be told with restraint. Stone struck stone, towers shook, sections of wall were battered day after day. Defenders repaired what they could, fought where they had to, and waited for help that never came in enough strength. The military orders stood among the fiercest defenders, especially the Templars and Hospitallers. But courage could not replace numbers, unity, or time. As the walls weakened, The old divisions inside Acre mattered less and more at once. Less because all faced the same danger, more because years of rivalry had left the city without the deep unity it needed. The Crusader world had often survived through stubbornness, but stubbornness is not the same as strength. Against the organized pressure of the Mamluks, Acre's exhausted defenders could only delay. When the Mamluks broke through in May 1291, the city's final hours unfolded in confusion, flight, and collapse. People rushed toward the harbor, desperate for ships. Some escaped by sea. Many did not. Streets that had held markets, prayers, arguments, and memories became routes of terror. Fortified compounds resisted for a time, but one by one the last points of defense failed. The fall of Acre did not mean every crusading idea vanished in a single morning. Other small holdings lingered briefly. Plans for new expeditions would still be discussed. Popes and kings would still speak of recovery. But as a real political presence in the Holy Land, the old Crusader states had reached their end. Acre became the symbol because it had been the last great doorway. The loss carried a quiet finality. For nearly 2 centuries, Latin Christians had tried to hold pieces of the eastern Mediterranean through vows, castles, ships, treaties, marriages, military orders, and repeated waves of crusading hope. Some efforts had been brave, some had been foolish, some had been sincere, some had been cruel. All of them now seemed to gather at Acre's broken walls. For Muslims in the region, the victory marked the removal of a foreign frontier that had shaped politics and memory for generations. For Western Christians, it was grief, shame, and distance. Jerusalem was already gone, but Acre's fall meant there was no longer a strong base from which to dream of return. The Holy Land had become, again, a place mostly reached by pilgrimage, negotiation, or imagination. And so the kingdoms beyond the sea faded. Not all at once in memory, but in reality. Their castles became ruins, their streets changed rulers, their names entered chronicles. The crosses did not disappear from history, but they no longer commanded those shores. The tide moved in and out as before. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean, merchants still bargained, pilgrims still prayed. But the age of Outremer had ended, leaving behind stories of holy war, lost kingdoms, and promises that time had broken. From this silence, the Crusades passed into another life, not as armies before the walls, but as memory, argument, warning, and dream carried forward through centuries. Their echoes would not vanish, they would simply change their shape. The Crusades did not end when Acre fell into silence. Armies dispersed, kings died, castles changed hands, and the old Latin kingdoms disappeared from the shores they had once tried to hold. But the memory of the Crusades remained, carried in chronicles, sermons, songs, ruins, prayers, grievances, and dreams that outlived the people who first took the cross. They were holy wars, but never only holy. They were journeys of faith, but also of ambition, fear, hunger, politics, pride, and misunderstanding. They produced courage and cruelty, devotion and betrayal, hospitals and massacres, treaties and broken vows. They brought distant peoples into contact through violence, trade, diplomacy, translation, suspicion, and uneasy coexistence. For some, the Crusades became stories of sacrifice and sacred duty. For others, they became memories of invasion, loss, and suffering. Both memories mattered because history is rarely held in one hand alone. It is carried differently by those who marched, those who resisted, those who survived, and those who inherited the shadows afterward. The lost kingdoms of Outremer remind us how difficult it is to turn a dream into a lasting world. Jerusalem could be imagined from far away as pure and eternal, but the real city stood among taxes, walls, markets, soldiers, neighbors, and fear. Promises made in churches became far more complicated on roads, deserts, and battlements. And now, as this story settles, the banners lower and the roads grow quiet. The castles fade into stone, the ships vanish beyond the evening sea. What remains is not a simple lesson, but a softer understanding that faith can move mountains, but it can also lose its way, that kingdoms rise under sacred words and fall under human weight. The night is calm now. The old voices have grown distant, Let them rest, and let yourself rest too.